Okay, thank you very much for having me here this evening. I feel like a little bit of an interloper because I am, as described, a historian of women in Parliament, but my research has taken me in the direction of liquor legislation somehow, so here I am today. Temperance is usually viewed as a Victorian movement, but its ideals lived well into 20th century policy making. Before 1923, a teenager could go into a pub at the age of 14 to buy and drink beer, and age 16 he or she could also buy spirits. If this seems strange to us today, it is testament to the long legacy of the Intoxicating Liquor Sale to Persons Under 18 Act 1923. Although the Act itself has been superseded by later licensing legislation, it introduced the principle that people should be aged 18 to drink alcohol in bars. It was also the first private member's bill, that is to say, a bill put forward by a backbench MP rather than a government minister, which was passed by a woman MP, and this was Nancy Astor, a great temperance advocate. So my talk today is going to cover three areas. It will firstly situate Astor's bill in the wider history of women temperance in the First World War. It will then set the scene for Astor's involvement, the relevance of Edwin Scrymgeour, Britain's only Prohibitionist MP, and the significance of a petition for 116,000 teachers. Finally, it will consider the parliamentary passage of the bill and the face of die-hard opposition from many of Astor's fellow Conservative MPs. So to start with, the broader context. So temperance, or abstinence from alcoholic drink, is usually positioned as a Victorian age movement in UK history. Brian Harrison's seminal book Drink and the Victorians ends its coverage as early as 1872, and he is clear that temperance ceased to be a live political issue after the First World War. This position is repeatedly echoed in later historical surveys. The work of Margaret Barrow and Gemma Alton on the main women's temperance organisations, the British Women's Temperance Association, BWTA, and the Women's Total Abstinence Union, WTAU, also ends with the First World War. Studies of women and drink more generally after 1918 concentrate on perceptions of women drinkers and women's attitudes to alcohol. And yet, despite undoubted decline from its Victorian heyday, temperance organisations were active after 1918. They were lobbying Nancy Astor for a start. Her papers at the University of Reading include hundreds of letters from women's temperance branches. The WTAU reported dutifully on the progress of her bill in its periodical wings. The British Temperance League was lobbying MPs during the passage of the bill through Parliament. So what had changed in relation to temperance? Paul Jennings talks helpfully about how the nature of it changed from being a well-supported and organised movement in the 19th century to widespread acceptance of more general temperance sentiment in society in the 20th century. And it's certainly true, there was new thinking on public health issues, reflecting in part military and imperial concerns during the Boer War and the First World War for the health of the nation. As described by Virginia Berridge, rather than place the onus on individuals to change their behaviour by taking a pledge, the state moved to take responsibility and legislate. The UK reframed its position on addictive substances from a situation where virtually everything was legal towards state control for alcohol and tobacco and prohibition of drugs. By contrast, the USA went for prohibition of alcohol between 1920 and 1933, as is well known. There was also direct First World War legislation to restrict the alcoholic drink trade, which has been studied by historians such as John Greenaway and Robert Duncan. From 1915, under the Central Control Board, of which Astor's husband Waldorf was an enthusiastic member, alcoholic strength of liquor and hours of sale were reduced, prices raised, food and non-alcoholic refreshments introduced, and incentives to drink such as treating or buying rounds were prohibited. There was also the Carlisle experiment, state management of pubs and breweries in the naval town of Carlisle, which did not end until 1974. For the Astors, Carlisle was a shining example of success of local disinterested management of liquor. Historians of drink also note more general post-war effects. After 1913, levels of beer consumption and convictions for drunkenness dropped. Drink was regarded less as a cause of societal problem than a symptom, with a focus on social causes such as housing and education instead. And in this wider context, I would suggest that Astor's bill provides some alternative evidence that older discourses about the vice of drink and the virtue of temperance were not quite dead by 1923. So that moves me on to the build-up to 1923, setting the scene. So Nancy Astor was elected to the House of Commons as Conservative MP for Plymouth Sutton in November 1919, and this is her election address. She was a strong advocate of temperance. This stemmed in part from family upbringing, religious views and personal experience. Her first husband was an alcoholic. It was also part of her feminism. In her parliamentary career, Astor championed many causes affecting the lives of women and protection of children, including widows and orphans' pensions, provision of nursery schools, raising the age of consent and reducing maternal mortality. Raising the drinking age was consistent with all this. Despite changing the law, Astor's bill has not received much attention by historians. Although she has many biographies, not one has an index entry for this bill. In the literature on temperance and drink and child protection legislation, her bill is usually given one sentence or overlooked in favour of the Children's Act 1908, and sometimes even confused with that act. Alternatively, Waldorf is given credit, with his formidable wife an afterthought. Astor was American-born and keenly aware of activity in the US, yet her bill does not feature in Prohibition histories either. But in Parliament, Astor made a name for herself as a temperance advocate from the beginning. She made her maiden speech on liquor traffic restrictions on the 24th of February 1920, effectively defending the Carlisle experiment. In this speech, the first ever by a woman MP, she said, "I am perfectly aware it does take a bit of courage to address the House on that vexed question of drink." Her parliamentary efforts around that vexed question initially focused on the local option or local veto. This idea, more widely discussed in 19th century politics, was to empower a local authority to take a vote on sale of intoxicating liquor in their area. There was more recent precedent for this, as the Temperance Scotland Act 1913 implemented the local option in Scotland from 1920. Some districts did go dry as a result, although the overall effect was limited. Astor put forward a similar bill in August 1922, which sought to introduce the local option in England, and this followed a similar bill from Bishop Burge, the Bishop of Oxford, which gained some support in the House of Lords during the 1920s. But Astor's local option bill got nowhere in the Commons. In November 1922, there was a general election, and Astor was punished for her stance on liquor with a rival independent Conservative candidate in her constituency, Plymouth Sutton, who was backed by the drink trade. Dr. Hugh Wansley Bailey split the Conservative vote in what would otherwise have been a straight fight between her and Labour, and he got more than 4,000 votes. Astor still won with a reduced majority. In the same election, the UK got its first and only Prohibitionist MP. Edwin Scrymgeour, leader of the Scottish Prohibition Party, who famously ousted Winston Churchill in Dundee. The SPP was founded in 1901 to secure the abolition of drink through independent political action. Scrymgeour had been prominent in local politics for many years. It was believed he had visited virtually every household in Dundee several times. He was known for his charisma and rhetoric and for supporting peace, arbitration and disarmament. His wider programme was substantially that of the Labour Party, including public ownership of industry. Now, on the surface, his election might seem like a welcome development for Astor, surely a natural ally. And she may have tried to make a connection, as she frequently invited him to receptions at her home, but he chose not to attend. Scrymgeour is likely to have felt little in common with Astor, her conservative politics, or position in high society, and he may not have felt any affinity even in relation to drink, because his uncompromising position was that anyone not for prohibition was against it. Astor's cherished local option was the supreme heresy. Ultimately, this is likely to have worked in Astor's favour, because although her opponents might throw accusations of prohibitionism at her, with him in the House of Commons, she would never be the Prohibitionist MP. The 1922 election also brought in a Conservative government, not directly helpful for Astor because the drink trade was far more influential in the Conservative Party than in the Liberal or Labour parties. As the new Parliament begun, a cross-party temperance group was formed in the House of Commons in January 1923, with Astor as a vice-chairman, aiming to ballot for temperance bills. The only way to get a private member's bill to succeed, then as now, was high benches ballot to get parliamentary time, government and cross-party support also being required in practice. And Astor won third place in the ballot in 1923, Edwin Scrymgeour not far behind in seventh place. She said at the time, "Fancy old Scrymgeour and me in the first 7 places. It really looks like what he said was true and God is on the side of temperance." However, it became apparent that his bill would be for full prohibition, and Astor distanced herself accordingly. When his prohibition bill was debated on the 20th of April that year, she was conspicuously absent. His bill required an immediate ban on alcohol as a beverage, only allowing it for scientific, industrial and medicinal purposes, and this would be supplied in bottles marked poison. This never had a chance of succeeding. It was defeated on division with just 14 votes in favour to 236 against. Astor, having won her ballot place, could easily have reintroduced her 1921 bill on the local option. However, this was not likely to be well received, as she had found, and unlike Scrymgeour, Astor recognised the value of practical politics as well as principle. So instead, she chose a bill restricting the sale of intoxicating liquor to under 18s. She could be confident that this would enjoy enormous public support because in 1921, the Teachers' National Petition Committee had instigated a petition signed by 115,867 teachers from public secondary and elementary schools. And it read, as you can see on the screen, "We, the undersigned teachers, earnestly pray His Majesty's Government to take steps to prohibit the serving of intoxicating liquors of all kinds on licensed premises to people under the age of 18. The petition was delivered to Herbert Fisher, who was then President of the Board of Education, by a deputation of teachers on the 15th of April 1921. And it did have an effect on Fisher because by 1923 he was a backbencher and became one of the formal supporters of Astor's bill. So, and that brings us on to Astor's bill itself and what happened to it. So there was only a short time after the ballot to draft the bill before it was introduced to the House of Commons on the 16th of February 1923. There has been a tendency by some historians to stress her husband Waldorf's involvement with the bill at her expense. As the bill files at the University of Reading show, though, Waldorf was indeed very important in drafting the bill and lobbying behind the scenes. He organised the draft, got legal advice and sought support inside and outside Parliament. All his research, lobbying and analysis was obviously extremely valuable for Astor. Indeed, it was essential. However, none of this should detract from the role of Astor herself. She was the person who actually had to get the bill through the House of Commons, stand up in the face of fierce and often rowdy opposition, make the case and argue each point. She needed a strong supporting cast to do so, but she was not just a mouthpiece. Astor's bill had its second reading when principles are debated on the 9th of March. She introduced it with full credit to the teachers who had asked for this legislation. She was keen to show broad support, explaining the bill had the support of all organised women, the highest medical authorities and church leaders. She drew on her own personal experience as a mother. During debate, she was called a fairy godmother, an angel of peace and an angel of light. Charles Crook MP seconded the bill, drawing on his own knowledge and experience as a teacher. Although some hostile MPs challenged the expertise of teachers, probably more would have agreed with the opinion of Robert Morrison, who said, "I am more entitled to be impressed more by a petition signed by 116,000 teachers than to take notice of a letter such as I received this morning from a firm of brewers." Labour, the main opposition party, were fully supportive of the bill. Philip Snowden compared the situation to children aged 8 working in coal mines and factories in the past. Opposition to the bill came entirely from the Conservative benches, led by Walter Greaves Lord, a barrister who dissected the detail, stressed practical difficulties and hinted darkly that the bill would lead to prohibition. He was seconded by Major Sir George Hamilton, who drew a picture of 17-year-old boys out for long bike rides, deprived of having a pint of good British ale along the way, and declared he would have supported the bill if it only applied to spirits or to girls. MPs competed to be the youngest drinker present. Lieutenant Colonel Martin Archer-Shee remembered, "I was a cadet at the age of 13 and the state provided us with beer and cider." Greaves Lord went a year younger than that, saying, "I had beer served to me at home from the time I was 12. But Frederick Banbury, pictured here, outdid them all, saying, "I believe that from about 10 to 11 years of age, I always had beer at my dinner. When I was at Winchester, we always had beer at dinner and supper." And Snowden remarked, "I am very anxious that as much time as possible should be given to the opponents of this bill, and therefore I shall not speak very long." But Banbury clearly took pride in being the blocker. He was a well-known backbench opponent of legislation and change, and this was exacerbated by his attitude towards women MPs, which he regarded as nothing short of an outrage. Banbury denied there was a drink problem and held no truck for the example of other countries, lobbying letters or the teachers, harking back to a supposed golden age when the father was head of the household and the mother stayed at home and looked after the children. Despite all this, the government provided necessary support, allowing a free vote. The bill promptly passed 2 divisions with clear victories of 335 votes to 70 and then 338 votes to just 56. Maud Scott from the WTAU was present and reported on it as a great moment for the temperance movement. The bill next came to Standing Committee C between the 27th of March and 17th of April, and it had a tumultuous time there. 2 important amendments were made which materially altered the bill from Astor's original intentions. The first was the introduction of the word knowingly, so the Act as passed declared that a licence holder would not knowingly sell or allow any person to sell, nor should any servant of his knowingly sell any intoxicating liquor to any person under the age of 18. The knowingly amendment was introduced by Greaves Lord, who argued that it was unjust to convict people who didn't know they were committing an offence. The bill promoters counter-argued that this effectively gave licensees an out, with Astor saying that the amendment would make the bill of little value. But the knowingly amendment passed with 24 votes to 16. As well as outright opponents, those voting for the knowingly amendment included some supporters of the bill, such as Charles Crook. So clearly this argument did have resonance beyond Conservative diehards. The second amendment, which made an exception to the age 18 rule by allowing some forms of alcohol to be supplied to 16 and 17-year-olds. And as passed, the bill read, "Nothing shall prevent the sale, supply and purchase of beer, porter, cider or perry to or by a person over the age of 16, where such liquor is sold, supplied or purchased only for consumption at a meal to be consumed at the same time." This amendment demonstrated a strong feeling in Parliament and society that not all alcohol was equally bad. Greaves Lords had introduced amendment after amendment over many days in committee to make the bill cover stronger intoxicating liquors, spirits and wine, but not weaker liquors such as beer and cider, which he claimed to be harmless and natural. On the 12th of April, Charles Roberts came in with this compromise, that weaker liquors could be served with meals only. Roberts had temperance connections. His wife Cecilia was president of the BWTA, so this might seem like a very retrograde step for him. But it became clear that this was the only way to save the bill. The amendment passed 38 votes to 5. All the bill's supporters voting for it in the end. Astor's last remark was, "Better something than nothing." And although significantly amended, the bill did finally pass committee stage in this form. Astor's bill should have returned to the Commons on the 29th of June, but it ran out of time that day thanks to her old enemy Frederick Banbury, who spoke at length on another bill that day to her frustration. It came back for report stage and third reading on the 13th of July, a rowdy sitting with MPs constantly saying, "Speak up." Maud Scott from the WTAU was again watching and wrote how members tried almost every means in their power to block the bill, writing, "No words can adequately convey the tense anxiety of those 2 hours." Banbury again moved to delay the bill, blaming Astor's womanly charms for influencing the government. He also claimed that beer was a food containing nourishment, whereas tea was a drug. This interesting argument harked back to a Victorian fear of tea as a stimulant, which contributed to fears of national decline and decadence, as described by historians such as Ian Miller. Edwin Scrymgeour was also present and spoke at this point, opposing the bill on the rather different grounds that measures like this constitute a safety measure for the continued existence of the liquor traffic, proven by the fact that the government supported this ridiculous piece of humbug. Such rhetoric could only have helped Astor by showing that her bill was at the moderate end of the temperance spectrum. The bill overwhelmingly passed third reading with 257 votes to just 10. Scrymgeour did not vote. One can only assume he could not bear to walk through the division lobby with the likes of Banbury, so abstained instead. The WTAU sent telegrams of congratulations to Astor and to the Prime Minister for giving facilities to the bill. The bill then moved on to the House of Lords, introduced by Waldorf. It had a smooth passage and achieved royal assent on the 31st of July 1923. In conclusion, Astor's bill achieved its aim of restricting supply of intoxicating liquors to people under 18, although compromises were made which reduced its impact. This demonstrates the continuing strength of drinking culture in the UK after the First World War. Beer in particular was regarded sympathetically. As a Labour politician observed in 1915, while everyone considered drunkenness a bad thing, almost everyone considered beer a good thing. But Astor did not consider beer to be a good thing, and the amendments were greatly disappointing to her. However, it must be recognised that all legislation is the result of compromise. A more radical bill on the local option would never have succeeded. As it was, there was huge opposition from some who would never compromise. Its survival depended on compromise from others, Astor, her supporters, and her less extreme opponents such as Greaves Lord. One great irony is that an actual Prohibitionist MP saved Astor from being labelled the Prohibitionist MP and gave her a more moderate position in Parliament. Astor's bill shows the UK temperance movement alive and kicking long after its Victorian heyday and enjoying legislative success, and deserves to be better remembered as such. The teachers' petition was crucial in framing the bill as one with wide public support from a responsible and expert section of society. It also passed thanks to Astor's leadership and passion in the House of Commons and perseverance in the face of die-hard opponents, and should be regarded as one of the greatest achievements of her parliamentary career. Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to know more, I'm very happy to take questions, of course, but if you would like to know more, I have written an article about this, which is titled Astor the Fairy Godmother. It's an open access article, and if you Google Astor the Fairy Godmother, you should find it. Thank you very much.